What if I told you there was something you could do that would cut your risk of dying over the next 15 years by 30%? Would you be interested? How about if it also helped protect you against anxiety, depression, and loneliness, and helped you find more meaning and purpose in life? And what if it didn't only help you flourish, but society too? Would you think that's valuable? Well, when it comes to religion, those data are real. The more people in societies engage with religion, the happier and healthier they tend to be. Now, none of us here are naive enough to believe that religion is a magic bullet or that you can't lead a good life without it. We also recognize that religion's power to move hearts and minds can be abused, and that leads to many kinds of violence and discrimination throughout history. But on average, and I say this as a social scientist, it's becoming clear that religion can help us meet the challenges life throws at us. Yet right now, at this moment, people are turning away from faith in droves. Secularization in the US is at an all-time high. Many houses of worship sit empty. So that raises a question. If religion does help us flourish, is there a danger in leaving it behind? And if the answer to that question is yes, where does that leave us? Can religion be replaced? Or are there ways to adapt the ancient wisdom that come from those traditions to meet our needs in society today? I'm Dave DeSteno, host of the PRX podcast, How God Works, where we take a look at the science behind spirituality. And I can't think of a better set of people to have this discussion with than the three in front of you. You may know all of them, but in case you don't, let me offer brief introductions. Krista Tippett, creator and host of On Being, whose work at the intersection of religion and society has earned her well-deserved honors, including a Peabody Award and a National Humanities Medal. Father Greg Boyle, a New York Times bestselling author and founder of Homeboy Industries, a hugely successful gang intervention, rehabilitation, and reentry program in Los Angeles, who has received the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his work. And Rabbi Shira Stutman, author of the acclaimed book, The Jewish Way to a Good Life, and founder of Mixed Multitudes, an organization that exposes diverse groups of Jews to the wisdom of Jewish life, tradition, and conversation. And she's also my buddy from PRX. She co-hosts the PRX Chutzpah podcast with Hannah Rosen. So let's get started. Krista, I want to start with you. Even if it's true that religion can help us lead more fulfilling lives, why do we need it? I mean, to play devil's advocate, which might be an apropos name here, isn't religion just an outdated tool? I mean, when it comes to finding happiness and optimizing our lives, there are other ways. We have therapy. We have science-backed strategies and life hacks. Aren't those better and more modern ways to go?
At some point as I created my show, which was very controversial to do a program on public radio 25 years ago about this subject because it was considered to not be serious. The truth is, and one of the things I realized is that what I was interested in, because the fear on public radio was that it would be proselytizing, exclusionary, inflammatory. And I wanted, in my mind, those are ways human beings do this, but not essential and organic to the traditions. What I came to understand in my work is that these traditions, what I'm interested in is the animating questions that gave rise to these traditions, and that we now have millennia of a conversation across generations about the great questions of meaning. They are the human, they are the universal, enduring, ancient human questions. What does it mean to be human? How will we live? And the question that religious traditions at their best remind us is inextricable from the question of what it means to be human is who will we be to each other? I'm speaking a lot these days about this as part of the human enterprise that is as essential as ever before. Let me just start with that.
I think you raise an interesting point, but what do we mean to each other? And we've heard this a lot at Aspen today, throughout the past couple of days. A lot of our life is focused on me. How do I make me better? But I think in these traditions, the question that you're pointing to is they point to virtues of how we interact with each other. What are the deep moral questions?
The radical move of religion in its origins was to suggest that my well-being is linked to more than the well-being of my kin and tribe. And that remains a radical idea.
Aspen Ideas and Gallup just released a survey called the American Values Index, which shows that the majorities of people think virtues like kindness, gratitude, humility, how we treat others fairly, are among some of the most important in life. And on that, as Krista said, they agree with religious traditions. But the question is there an actual link there? Does religion actually help us get to those? And so, Greg, you've been working to reduce gang violence and to help young people find their way for a long time. And that means living these values. It means living kindness, empathy, even when it's really hard or tiring. And so I'm wondering, how does your spiritual life fit in here? Does it help you be focused and resilient even when you're facing difficult situations?
Yes. Next. No, I'm just kidding. It's a privilege to be with all of you. And yeah, I think we don't name things correctly always. Like I recoil at the word religion. I go, what are we talking about? I come from a tradition, and I was born a Catholic. I'll die a Catholic. I'm okay with that, But it's religion is about longing and not about behaving, and so we have to move away from something. So I was, and in line with Krista said, I was in my office with a homie who just had a meltdown, and he was sobbing, and I think overwhelmed in the moment by what had happened to him in his life and what he had to carry, neglect and abandonment and abuse and violence and incarceration, but it just hit him. He was sobbing. He could barely speak. And then he asked me, has God disowned me? And then he continued to sob more. Then he looked at me and he says, have you? And I realized in that instant that the only way he will know that this is not on God's mind is if he knows it's not on my mind. And it's the only thing that matters, it seems to me. So I'm okay with people kind of poo-pooing religion. There's the kind of the Church of Homeboy Industries where we're there and it's people feel cherished and seen and safe and they belong and they help each other because we're being invited to be in the world who God is. And that's the only way that guy or anybody's going to know that God is compassionate and loving and merciful. So we choose to do that. But the problem is not so much religion, I don't think, as it is, we're created in the image and likeness of God, but as Richard Rohr says, our image of God also creates us. So then, if our God is petty and judgmental and an abusive father, what choice do you have except to be that? But once you find this kind of spacious, expansive notion of how God is, and the only thing that God wants is for us to be that in the world with each other, as you said right now, and I think that's where we need to focus, not on how do we get people back into church.
I think one thing we often neglect to think about in this country, which is predominantly Christian-based, is that religion is as much about what you do as what you believe. And I know, Father Greg, I've heard you talk about how you engage in practices like meditation or the Ignatian Examen, things that kind of are practices that help you find that compassion and empathy. And so sure, let me ask you, as a rabbi, you help people through all types of challenges, becoming parents, finding ways to forgive each other, dealing with grief and suffering. What are some of the ways that you've seen the wisdom and practices of these faiths help people through difficult times?
Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you to the Institute for having me here. look, and thank you for reading my bio, but the one thing you didn't read is that just last week I moved here to Aspen to become the senior rabbi of the Aspen Jewish congregation, which is, yes, one of the best rabbi gigs like in the world. And one of the things that's been happening over the last few years as I've been working with the Aspen Jewish congregation is the congregation has started to grow. And as we've started to grow, we've had to ask this question of, like, why do we exist in the first place? Like, why are we here? And so we had to answer this question of, like, what are the technologies that we have, Judaism has, not uniquely, maybe other faith traditions have them as well, but that we have that can help, that can really help people live life. Because whether you live in Aspen or in LA or in, do you still live in Minnesota?
No, but
okay, fine. That's, to me, you'll always live in Minnesota, but like, right, wherever you live, right, life is really hard. And in this moment, for many communities, including the Jewish community, it's hard. Like, how can religion be of service to you? And so we came up with just three core foundations, three core values that religion has to offer. One is this idea of sacred time, right? That every day is not like the day before it. That we have this life, we don't know how long it will be, and some days we say are days of chol, days of just going to work, and some days are days of Yom Tov. They are holy days. And whether you call those days Yom Kippur or Christmas or your mother-in-law's birthday, there are some days that are sacred. That is one thing that religion can give to you that can get you from one difficult moment to the next. The other thing that, as we're trying to figure out what does this synagogue have to offer is responsibility to each other. And this is a little bit, Father Greg just talked about this a little bit a moment ago, responsibility to each other, including to our enemies, right? Each other, as Krista said earlier, doesn't end with our family, it doesn't end with our co-religionists, and it doesn't even end with the people who live in our city. It ends even with the people that we hate, which is something, of course, that we're struggling with in America and around the world, I think, right now. And then the last thing is just, religion just gives us a tree to lean on in our most difficult moments. Like, someone gets sick, and if you don't know what to do, religion can help you through it. Someone dies, we have these practices in Judaism. You have the funeral, you have the Shiva, you have the 30 days, you have the year. Religion can hand it over to you. And so you're born a Catholic, you know what to do when someone dies. You're born a Jew, you know what to do. You don't have to do it, but it's there for you. And one reason it can be meaningful is because it's been meaningful to millions of people who have been alive before you, and God willing, millions of people who will be alive after you.
Speaking as the scientist up here, I want to say, and I learned this phrase from Krista, spiritual technologies. There's a lot of scientific evidence that these practices work, right? We have data that shows when people engage in meditation, it actually increases their compassion. When they contemplate death, it actually points you toward the things that actually bring happiness in life, rather than the things that we all kind of get caught up. And they're built in to the rhythm and rhyme of these services. But you're raising an important point, which is what do we do? How do we reach beyond the boundaries that are difficult to cross sometimes? Or how do we deal with the anger and sorrow we're feeling? Finding purpose in life, dealing with grief, those are things that are common to the human tradition. But so too are things like feeling like your society is being ripped apart. I mean, for millennia, these traditions have dealt with societies undergoing major upheaval. And today, our society feels like that is happening again. We're witnessing violence against immigrants, the erasing of identity and social safety nets, the ravages of climate change. So what do we do, Krista, when we feel that anger or sorrow or hopelessness in the face of things like this? Does religion offer us anything?
Well, I actually don't know a text that more absolutely honors and brings, in fact, before God all of the harshest things we feel and experience than the Hebrew Bible. It brings, the Psalms always move through, or they all, as a whole, and often individually, move through rage and railing against your enemies and sorrow and also insisting on a value of praise and gratitude. You know, to what you just said, David, I think one of the most interesting things for me about focusing on this subject here in this last quarter century, this 21st century, is that even as that inherited belonging, that inherited identity, which actually has defined most human societies across the history of our species from the very beginning, is falling away. And yet, the longing, and especially in the young, is as alive as ever before. And also, people like you, neuroscientists and social psychologists, are taking religious experiences and human experiences that religion has honored and put ritual around and cultivated with text and teaching and leadership, and showing how they work, right? So like something like awe is not just good for you, it has immunological protective effects, right? We're learning things like that. Mm-hmm. Grief, to your point, this is such a hard time. It's an overwhelmingly hard time, and we've actually been walking into this place for decades. We don't know how to grieve in this country. We don't do it. And the traditions are as wise as anything in the human enterprise, not just about the fact, which we actually all know in our lives, that if you don't metabolize grief, you don't get to another side of it. But the traditions also have rituals around that, right? I feel like during COVID, if we could all collectively have sat Shiva once a week, we would be healthier now.
Or lamentations, I often think about
Lamentation, is a word, just that word. Put that word in the middle of our culture is not something we know how to do or honor, and because of that, we do badly in these moments.
Shira, we're talking a little bit about politics here, and some of the things I raised were political. Do you think that it's been a mistake that the political left has ceded religion and spirituality to the right? I mean, in that Aspen and Gallup survey, right, half of Republicans say faith is a top value for them. But among Democrats, only 11% say the same. But if you think about the history, that's not the way it's always been. I mean, the civil rights movement, many of the leaders of that who were fighting for equality and justice were deeply spiritual individuals and used that language to make the case. And so do you think that's a mistake on the left's part?
I will answer that question, because it's very important, but I really want to speak for hours about what you just said, Krista. I think it's so moving, this idea of using sacred rituals to help us move through all the different, all of what we deal with as human beings. But yes, I think it's terrible that the left has ceded religion to the right. I think it's ridiculous. And I think that, first of all, we Jews do a terrible job of reading the prophets. Like, I haven't read the prophets all the way through my whole life. It's like a big embarrassment. Often when someone is trying to proselytize to me, they'll be like, well, obviously it says in Isaiah 34:12, X, Y, and Z, which means you're wrong. And I'm like, I've never read Isaiah, so I don't know. But if you do read the prophets, what you see is they were the most political human beings ever, and they spent all of their time railing against the government. And so religion is political across the spectrum. And for reasons that, even though I wasn't an American government major in college, I don't fully understand, and maybe some of you can explain, religion in America has been ceded to the right. In some ways, especially in the contemporary moment, especially during my lifetime, these last 50 years, and it breaks my heart because I believe in a God who wants to protect the vulnerable. And I believe, in my current position, I'm totally apolitical, so, there's only so much I can say here. But I believe that, there are certain positions that really care more about protecting the vulnerable than others, right? And so I believe in our Hebrew Bible that God says depending on how you count, 34 or 37 times. What is the role of a human being? To protect the oppressed, the vulnerable, the widow, or the orphan. That verse is said more than any other verse in the entire Torah. Why do people not talk about that more when we're talking about protecting immigrants of all sorts? It is something that keeps me up all night. The idea that religion is often ridiculed on the left and held as sacred on the right. And if you have any ideas about what we can do about it, I would take them during the Q&A.
Let me ask Father Greg here for a second, but before I do that, I think what you're seeing is a confluence of the point that Krista was making as well. On the left, there is this righteous anger for the way things are going and the sins that we're seeing and the violence being done to people. But we don't have a way to come together and express that mourning or lamentation might let us make meaning. I'm saying us, yes, I'm on that side, to come together to do this. And so, Father Greg, I know I read with interest, you had an op-ed in the LA Times arguing with, not directly, but with the debate between Pope Francis, who had recently passed, and our vice president on what it means to love as a Christian. That is, should we care about those who are more close to us, the Ordo Amoris? Is there a hierarchy of whose pain counts more? Or does everybody's pain count? And so how do you find that deeper meaning and kind of reclaim those values of universal love?
Well, I think you tap into the longing of people, even folks on the left. I mean, if you're asking them about religion, I'm kind of probably with them. It's probably we're down here because you're thinking it's institutional churches. And that's not flying for people who have a deep longing for community and belonging and a belief that everybody is unshakably good, as I believe. So God in the covenant says, as I have loved you, so must you have a preferential care and love for the widow, orphan, and the stranger. And so it's not about love me back. So people don't connect to the things that perhaps in that survey, I'm not sure we identify things correctly, and people are longing not just to point things out, but to point the way. Somebody point the way. Where do we go? How do we walk? I was on a plane recently, and every screen, as I was returning to my seat from the restroom, they were all watching Conclave. And so it was a month ago or so it was timely. But I went back and looked at it, and there's that line at the end where the guy, I don't want to ruin it for you, but the guy who ends up becoming Pope, and he says, the church is not about tradition. The church is not about the past. The church is about what do we do next? And I thought that was pretty good. And so, but if you talk to people about, say, in my tradition, what are the things that Jesus takes seriously? Inclusion, nonviolence, unconditional loving kindness, compassionate acceptance. Nothing else. Those four things. Would a survey issue in people saying, yes, I'll have what he's having, that they will vote for that because it's about longing. It taps into where we want to go next. It says not so much just point things out, but please point the way. But the point about religion, and I think of what we're saying, is community, that people need community. And so we blur these lines. We talk about, practice and meditation, and people, take account of sacred time in their lives. And it may not be, maybe they haven't found a community yet, but I think that's the longing. Even in 12-step programs and recovery, and people at Homeboy, people are connected to this longing all day long. They don't want to, homie said to me the other night, I don't want to go home because it is more home than home. And 5 o'clock comes and he dreads that moment because he's going to go home. It's not so much what's at home or what isn't there, but it's what's here. People they know my name and they're hugging me and they're wanting to know how I'm doing. That's what any religion hopes to do, is find your community. But if people aren't finding it there, then they find it elsewhere.
I think a lot of people are looking for that, as you said. And people will often say to me, when I talk about the benefits of religion, they'll say, yeah, Dave, it's just, people coming together. You would get the same benefits if you joined a bowling club or any other club. And if you look at the data, coming together, having community is good no matter how you do it. But if you look at the data, the boost you get to your well-being, to your feeling of connection, is greater for religious community than those other types. And so the question is, what are we finding there that helps us do this? Now the big thing is everybody's looking for the transcendent, to kind of touch that experience of unifying love. How are they doing it? Psychedelics, right? There's, go to Brooklyn, your local hipster is going to be microdosing psychedelics. But religions give people ways to this experience in containers that help keep that love going. So I know, Father Greg, you've talked about kind of having transcendent mystical experiences and realizing that, as you said, it is about universal love and connection, not the institutions. How are ways that people can find that feeling themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to disparage that. I just was in Boston and I preached at St. Cecilia's.
Oh, yeah.
It was packed, not because I was preaching at St. Cecilia's, but that's their norm, packed. And it was alive. And it was like 2 hours long, which is not my style, but it was extraordinary. And so people find not just a community, which they do, but they've rolled up their sleeves. It's love in action. And that matters. People are kind of out there and wanting to know what to do next, and so that they can live as though the truth were true and put first things recognizably first, and they do it together. And it makes sense that there could be a place where you discover, a mystical activism, where you go, oh, together we're going to try to see as God sees. We know that mass deportation, you cannot align that with the energy of the God of love. You can't do it. It's impossible. But that's heartening, because now you know you're in the right path. And so, but you have to invite people to something that's more inclusive and expansive. And just one thing on that, the mystical view is always kind of this next step over. And homie, we were talking about forgiveness, and he says, I'm not big on forgiveness, And he worked at Homeboy and worked with his enemies. He goes, there's too much back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. I just believe in fourth. And then he said, fourth is mercy. Mm-hmm. And then he said, God is mercy. Mm. And I said, I think that's the whole thing, because it's this expansive way of seeing the world and each other. It's not waiting. There is no waiting in mercy.
That's also a beautiful countercultural word.
Yeah, mercy.
Right?
It is.
Yeah.
Especially these days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We can say this, but a lot of people, rightly so, will say, I look to religion, and what I see there is discrimination, right? There's sometimes in these traditions, there's built-in biases against the LGBTQ community, people of other faiths, even women within a tradition, like in the tradition which I grew up in, Catholicism, women cannot be priests and take an equal role there. And so, Krista, I know you've talked a lot about the idea of religions, the institutions, as containers, but all religious institutions are human-run, and sometimes that can lead to these problems. So how do we find the truer meaning of mercy or compassion in them?
I don't know if I can answer that. That is a big question, but yeah.
That's why you're here.
Look, religions are containers for the essence, for those questions and those longings and the responses to them, and practices to keep reaching for them. And they're flawed, just like we are. They take on all of our flaws, and they get dropped and broken, and they get picked up and remade again and again. And we live in a century in which none of our institutions that came out of the 20th century are fit for purpose anymore. Our generation and our children are going to have to remake politics and what an economy is for, and religion, so that is an interesting adventure and challenge, and it's terrifying, and it's full of danger, and it's also an incredible, majestic calling. I want to say something, something that's on my mind about community. I think a dot we don't connect is when we, this crisis of community, this crisis of loneliness. Like, I speak to young people, and inevitably someone says, how do I create community or find community? And one of the things I do is just invite them to get conscious of the fact that that is a very new, unnatural question for a human being to have to ask. And religious communities have been places that were there for people even when they went into refuge, right? Even when they had to leave the place they came from, they could land as a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim or a Sikh, right? They would have a place to go. And to your point, so I just think we need, we're not going to get that back, right? So again, the remaking is going to happen. But that's part of the puzzle of why we suddenly find ourselves with this crisis of community. And to your question about the difference between a bowling club and a community of faith, distinctively, these are the places in the human enterprise where we're working on interior life as well as exterior life, right? And a word that I use even less often than I use the word religion is spirituality, because it just is so vague and it gets thrown around, it is amorphous. But what we're talking about, but we really need to be able to talk about the life of the Spirit, even in our life together, the soul of our nation. And what we're talking about, simply put, is interior life. The place in us where conscience and character are formed, and not merely accomplishment and knowledge and accumulation. And I would say that our country right now, and I think that interior life was made optional and compartmentalized and privatized, treated much less seriously than accomplishment and accumulation in the world in which I was born. And we are seeing the fruits of that now in our life together. But one other thing I just want to say is I think across our partisan lines, we need to cultivate conscience and character. These callings to lamentation, to humility, to repentance, to redemption are just as valid for anybody of any party who voted any way. We've been living with so much pain and so much fear on every side of our life together. And my question is, how in the falling away of the containers as we've known them and the inheritance as we've known it, like you were just born Catholic and that's what you were going to be, how can these traditions offer this deep intelligence and the tools for moral imagination which we need to rise to all of our civilizational callings, even in the absence of this kind of givenness?
One thing we're seeing from the scientific perspective, one of the things I study are people's emotions. And people tend to think, emotions just come over me. One of the most powerful things you can learn is that emotions don't come over you. You can curate your own emotional life. And it is in those practices and the wisdom of those practices that they help us do that and find forgiveness and mercy by working on our minds and bodies. But something you said I want to come back to, which is you don't use this word spirituality very much.
Yeah.
I mentioned at the start that people are leaving religion. They're leaving traditional faiths. But they're not all becoming ardent atheists, right? Surveys from Pew Research show that 70% of people say they're spiritual in some way. And that includes 25% of people who say they're spiritual but not religious. And so what I take from that, I share your concern about the word spirituality, but what I take from that is the longing, as you're hearing from everyone here, is alive and well. The question is, what form will it take going forward? Or as Father Greg says, what comes next? And it's interesting because a lot of people right now, when I say the word Burning Man, they think of it as this debaucherous party in the desert. And for some people it is. But there is data showing that people are having deeply spiritual experiences there because of the rituals involved, because of sharing that vulnerability in the harshness of that environment. And there's data, wonderful data from neuroscientist Molly Crockett at Princeton that shows it changes them even after they leave. And so to any of you, is there something in these powerful experiences, in these new ways that people are looking to find that feeling that current religious institutions can learn from so they can meet people's needs?
I think about this a lot, especially as a rabbi, because the thing about Burning Man is that you can go there. I've never been, so you all can tell me if I'm wrong, but I imagine that you can go there with no knowledge of the mores or the customs or whatever it is of Burning Man, and you can have a spiritual experience. Whereas it's very hard to walk into a synagogue on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year, if you know nothing about Judaism, you've never heard Hebrew before, you don't know anything about the standing and the sitting, and to have one of those experiences. And so I do think about how in 2025, when so many Jews know very little Hebrew, very little about the tradition, and Krista's using all these words like about lamentation and repentance. They don't know how the Jewish technologies to access that. How can we help people have the spiritual experience, however we define it, the first time, so that they'll come back the second time if they don't have the knowledge? And that is one of the greatest challenges of my profession.
At Burning Man, there's a group called Milk and Honey, which has 1,000-person Shabbat there. And so people are rediscovering their own faith. A friend of mine runs a camp at Burning Man called Religious AF, and I'm not going to say what the AF are, but you can figure it out. And there are people who are just, he says, I've never felt the love of God as palpably as when I felt it there serving other people. And there are people rediscovering their faith there too. So, I mean, Krista or Greg, what do you think current faiths can do to give people that fire? Or if there's nothing, where else are they going to find it?
I want you to talk more, because you do that every day.
Well, I think that I remember I was reading a New York Times editorial that said, we're teaching the wrong things in school. We should be teaching character, I think he said. And I thought, I'm not so sure, because again, my only reference point for the last 40 years is Homeboy Industries. We don't teach character there. But if people have a palpable experience of having been loved, what the byproduct of that is character. It's not a kind of but you didn't take the class on character.
Right.
No, loving people will become healthy people. And I was just thinking right now, I do like the word interiority, but it's always been seen, I think, as out of reach. It's the mystics, it's Teresa, it's Ignatius of Loyola. Rather than to say that, what's the goal of interiority? To know that you are loved without measure and without regret. That's the goal. That's, I think, what interiority is. We make it something out of reach, when in fact it's simple. It's about creating communities where folks can inhabit the truth of who they are and experience their own palpable dignity and nobility, and they feel loved, which leads them to their truest self, which is to say they will know that loving is their home, and they will never be homesick because now they know this. I think that's interiority.
In my world, we talk about this as from the bottom up rather than the top down.
Yeah.
And it's a
Or
very
from the
powerful
inside
way,
out,
or
even.
inside out. you want to add anything, Krista?
Well, I'm just thinking a lot these days, and Aspen Ideas Festival is not a bad place to name this. Like the 20th century was all about, hard and soft, right? And hard was strategy and war and politics, and we really thought that all the great problems could be picked up in the political sphere and solved there, and love was soft, and care was soft.
That's right.
When the pandemic hit in 2020, I believe that whole period set all of our civilizational callings before us. Racial, ecological, first time the West Coast caught fire, political. But the first thing that happened is that as a society and as a world, astonishingly, we had to ask the question of what is essential and what is non-essential. And almost in terms of what professions people we really needed to keep working. And almost every answer that came back had something to do with the giving of care, the practical giving of care. And those are not the professions that we reward or that we take seriously, but we actually all know in life that's it, that the Beatles were right.
So I want to close on one more question, and then we'll get to Q&A. And that's this. Given what we've talked about, and I hope that many of you can see that within these traditions there is a wisdom there. As I tell people in my line of work, I can't tell you if these are divinely inspired or the results of people figuring stuff out over millennia. But there is a wisdom in there that helps us meet what life throws at us. But what do you do if you're interested in a spiritual path, but feel like you just can't believe in any type of greater power? Do you need to believe before you start a practice, or do you even need to believe at all? And this is something that we struggle with a lot. We talk about a lot on my show. And the advice I like to give is a saying from Scripture that a wise rabbi once told me, and that is, nourish v'nishma. Shira, as another wise rabbi, would you like to do the translation and comment on that in terms of what it means to act but not believe at the start?
Yeah. So this comes from the book of Exodus. And it's when the Israelites stood at Sinai, and they were receiving revelation. And they said in front of God, Na'aseh v'nishma, we will do, and only then we will understand. And since that moment, for the last 3,000 years, it has stood as a core Jewish understanding that faith is lovely. It's nice if you can believe in God. It's nice if you can be in relationship with God. But faith is not at the core. What is at the core is doing the work of tikkun olam, right? Doing the work of healing this world. If we are asking questions of why are we here in the first place, which at some point in all of our lives, I would imagine that we ask, we are here to do the work of building a better world so that the world, because we believe that the world as it is not the world as it could be. And that we are in partnership with the God that we may or may not believe in to heal this broken world.
Thank you. And thanks to all of you. We are happy to take questions. Over there in the black, please.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Kanika. I'm 24 years old, and I'm not particularly religious, but I do believe that my generation has lost some of the language for the more divine and sublime and spiritual parts of life. And I have always envied that religious spaces have sort of baked into them, a way to talk about that intensity and that longing and those heavier parts of life. Like they have Sunday mornings and Tuesday evenings and potlucks and songs. And it doesn't feel like secular spaces in society really have that. Like when you go into polite society, those feelings that I think many of us share, that is something that you're meant to suppress for after 9 to 5, for late nights and long walks. And it's sort of pushed the edges. And I'm curious, from all of the time you've spent in this space, in the tension of what the rest of what the mainstream society is like, why is it like that? Why is it so compartmentalized?
I'm having trouble. I have kind of hearing trouble with the microphone and the sound. So, but maybe somebody. The question is,
the question was, why are secular spaces missing this?
why what?
Why don't we talk about this in non-religious spaces when these feelings of intensity and longing aren't monopolized by religion?
Third spaces are kind of falling away, and the secular attempts to kind of have them aren't really working. And so,
well, again, I think we try to fit things into old containers, and I think the word healing is really, a word that's really quite apt. So we were talking earlier about our mutual friend Vivek Murthy, who was Surgeon General previously, and he said, mental health is the defining health issue of our time. Now, if you look at that and you just go, oh yeah, we should probably give more money to mental health. No. Hate crimes are up 350%. The only way to explain that is to say that we aren't well, I think.
Yeah.
And how do we heal? Or in my world, fentanyl use and fentanyl overdoses, it's alarming. I've buried so many homies who have died from overdoses, suicides, isolation. We were talking about post-COVID. We've never really dealt with the grieving of that. All of that exacerbated. We think that we're talking about schizophrenia or something. No, we aren't healthy.
Right.
And healing is a kind of a powerful longing. And if people are loved and cherished in a community, they will roll up their sleeves. And they will, like Ram Dass says, we're all just walking each other home. But what are we walking each other home to? To healing, health, wholeness, wellness, well-being. I think that's how we explain we're in the situation we are right now. That I think we weren't entirely whole because of a lot of things that happened to us. And people, I think, voted against their own interests, frankly. And all of a sudden, it's an indicator of the fact that, we couldn't be one bit better, unshakably good, but we all could be healthier. And none of us are well until all of us are well. How do we help each other without judgment? Because it's not a value or moral assessment, it's a health assessment. And I think that's what people who love each other do all the time.
There in the white and black check. Sorry if I have the colors. Oh, no, it's not. It's just, yeah. Sorry.
Appreciate the panel so much. And I really appreciate your touching on character. And I wondered if
Can you hold the mic a little closer?
I wondered if you could expand on the definition of character a little bit more.
Character.
Appreciate your touching on it. Can you expand on the definition?
I'll do that as the psychologist, if you guys don't mind. We tend to think of character as something that is formed and is solid as you grow up. You have the devil on one shoulder and the angel on the other. Then they whisper in your ears, and if you listen to this one, you'll be good, and this one, you'll be bad. But it doesn't really work that way. What the science shows us is that character is malleable, right? When we see somebody good do something bad, we say, they must have been a wolf in sheep's clothing all along. But when we see somebody who is bad do something good, we say, oh, that's just an aberrant act. They're still bad. Right? The logic doesn't hold. So character is malleable. You can curate your own character. And one thing we're learning is that doing it from the bottom up sometimes is more powerful, or as Greg said, from the inside out. Experience can change you more than me telling you this is what you should do or this is what you should believe. And that's why the power in the practice of these traditions, I think, is really powerful. Over here in the blue. Sorry, one last thing I wanted to say on that is the wonderful thing about that view, that character is not fixed. I mean, the word character comes from the Greek word, which I won't pronounce, which meant the marks that were indelibly stamped on coins. Once you had it, that was it. Now that we know character can change, it actually means redemption is possible for all of us. And Miroslav Volf, the theologian, said to me one time, Dave, you know what the great thing about forgiveness is? It doesn't just help you drop the anger. it redeems the other person. It brings them back to God and his language to be renewed and have good character again. Sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you. How do you respond to the argument that religion is divisive, is at the root of wars, and attached to that, to the people who say, well, I don't believe in God or religion because it's not provable, it's not scientific?
I would just agree with them about the divisive part, because I don't know how you can argue with that. And which is why you need to find the community that believes what you believe. I think, and pretty soon people will go, the churches that are empty, maybe they need to be empty. And the churches that are packed are places where people find life and joy. And so I think that's okay. I don't want to fill those empty churches necessarily, but you do want to acknowledge that yet we have a church community, it's not divisive. That's part of who we are. In fact, we're going to be as inclusive as we can be, even given in my tradition horrific things, including the exclusion of women and members of the LGBTQ community as horrific. So indefensible. I won't defend it. And I'm a Roman Catholic, but I get how that is. You just do the best you can with each step you take.
When I first started my show in public radio, in a lot of the newsrooms, they would say, we can't talk about religion. Religion is at the root of all the world's worst problems. And there's an argument for certainly things done in the name of religion. And as I said, I think like the human drama is amplified when what is at stake is, the divine, right? But I think, so yes, it's true. There's truth to that. But then there comes the argument that we should just do away with religion because of that. But, you could say the same thing about politics, right? That politics is the root of all the world's worst problems, which for me is more of an argument that those of us who want these things to be true to their life-giving properties, have to step up and take them more seriously rather than less so.
But I think the truth is most wars aren't about religion. Religion gets pulled into them and used. And here's where the science, I think, is helpful, right? There's wonderful work by the psychologist Kurt Gray that shows and Joshua Jackson, that shows when people feel their way of life is threatened, suddenly their view of God, their understanding of God becomes that God is more punitive. Right? The Bible is a book of many voices. In there you can find verses that talk about love. You can find verses that talk about smashing the heads of your enemy's children against rocks. When we feel threatened, our mind focuses and remembers the ones that are more violent. And therefore it becomes easier to be caught up into divisiveness. And so I think the point is, as all of you are saying, is to find the kernel in these faiths, whether that's mercy, love, compassion, because on average, that's what's boosted. But like any ideology, like Krista says, it can be divisive. Go ahead, and then we have to end.
Just one. A therapist once said to me that being married is better than being single, but it's 51-49. And there are times that I feel that about religion too, that like religion having it is better than not having it, but it's 51-49, because I do think that there are times that religion is used. But I think that's often in the leadership, like in the leaders misuse religion for their wars and for their viciousness and the violence. But if you go to the street corners, like Homeboy Industries, for instance, right? You go to the street corners in every city and every town around the world, religion is being used for a lot of good and to care for people in a lot of different unseen ways and beautiful, beautiful ways that people just don't get to see, unfortunately, if they're not part of the community. And that's how I would respond to someone.
And as you said to me once, the Talmud teaches that synagogues are required to have windows.
Yeah. Right. So, Talmud teaches
because it's not just about what we're doing in here as the faith, but
right, but also reflecting out into the world that we're trying to build.
Anyway, thank you all. Some of us may be around. We're happy to talk.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, David.
Thank you.